She didn't believe in family anymore, until the single dad looked at her and said, "I need a wife, and you need strong sons." What began as a quiet encounter on a dusty back road would unravel a story of healing, unexpected love, and the kind of hope that only rises after everything else falls apart. This isn't just a love story. It's a story about purpose, sacrifice, and the miracle of two broken souls who dared to rebuild, together. Now, settle in. Let me tell you what really happened. The wind howled down from the Rockies that morning, sharp and dry, carrying with it the scent of snow not yet fallen. In the small Colorado town of Fox Hollow, 3 blocks wide and 2 stories tall, the rust-colored hangar at the edge of the volunteer search and rescue station stood like a sleeping giant, silent except for the occasional creak of corrugated steel. Inside, Colt Brennan stood alone beside an aircraft engine older than both of his sons put together. The twin-rotor chopper hadn't flown since August, when a lightning strike fried half its wiring. Technicians from Denver had come and gone, each leaving behind another invoice and another shrug. "Dead," one of them had said. "It's toast. Retire it." But Colt wasn't the type to bury a machine before listening to what it had to say. He stood perfectly still now, eyes closed, fingers resting lightly on the humming casing of the newly replaced ignition coil. A faint whir echoed through the hangar, then a hiccup. He tilted his head. There it was again. That uneven rattle, subtle, almost apologetic, like a singer clearing her throat before the first note. "She's not broken," he murmured to the empty air. "She's just been misunderstood." At the far end of the hangar, the massive double doors creaked open, letting in a burst of cold light. The silhouette of a woman appeared, tall, straight-backed, with a military rucksack slung over one shoulder. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun under a knit beanie, and her green fatigue jacket still bore the faded patch of the U.S. Army. Rainey Cross squinted into the dim interior, expecting the place to be empty. She had been told the aircraft here was grounded indefinitely. That's why she'd chosen this hangar to cut through on her way to the training fields behind the station. Instead, what she found was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, in a flannel shirt and jeans, crouched beside the very aircraft she'd been warned not to touch. His hands were on the engine, his eyes shut like he was praying. "Excuse me," she called. "That's restricted equipment." Colt opened his eyes slowly and looked up at her, not startled, just patient, as if he'd known she would come. "She's not restricted," he said. "She's waiting." Rainey stepped forward. "You're not authorized. Who are you?" He wiped his hands on a rag and stood, towering over her by at least half a foot. His voice, when he spoke again, was calm but low, like a stream carving through stone. "Colt Brennan, volunteer mechanic, and I'd bet you're the soldier from the new behavior program." Her eyes narrowed. "Captain Rainey Cross. And if this aircraft is offline, you shouldn't be touching it." He gave a half shrug. "Sometimes what's offline just needs someone to listen." Before she could reply, he turned and flipped the main switch. The engine coughed, then purred, uneven, but alive. Rainey's eyebrows shot up. She'd read the reports. This chopper wasn't supposed to work again. He adjusted a valve by feel. The timing was off by milliseconds. You can't see it on paper, but you can hear it, if you know how to listen. Rainey folded her arms. "You fixed it. Just like that." "I heard her sing," he said simply. She just needed someone to believe she still could. The engine's vibrations rolled through the floor like a heartbeat. Rainey watched him carefully. He didn't look like an engineer. No formal uniform, no clipboard. But something about the man felt solid, rooted, like a redwood that didn't bother explaining itself to passers-by. "So, what else do you fix by ear?" she asked, half skeptical, half curious. He met her gaze without flinching. "Engines, radios, sometimes hearts." There was a silence between them then, not awkward, not flirtatious, just full of something unspoken. She broke it first. "Well, Brennan, I've got a crew of teenage punks waiting to break my will out back. You planning to fix them too?" He smiled, just a flicker. "Not unless they come with spark plugs." She turned to go but paused at the door. "Thanks for whatever that was." "Listening," he said softly. That was listening. As she disappeared into the morning wind, Colt shut down the engine and let the silence reclaim the hangar. Later that afternoon, Rainey stood on the frost-bitten field behind the station, watching 4 teens in overgrown camo pants test her patience. They were part of a juvenile rehabilitation pilot program, her new assignment after 3 years of frontline training. The Army had called it community re-entry facilitation. She called it babysitting with a side of therapy. "Push-ups now," she barked. "I said 20. The boys groaned. One of them, a wiry kid named Darnell, rolled his eyes. "You gonna make us cry next, lady soldier?" Rainey stepped forward, calm and precise. "I've served 3 tours. I've trained men twice your size to climb walls in 30 seconds flat. You don't scare me, sweetheart." Darnell laughed, but there was less swagger in it now. Just then, she heard it again, that purring hum from earlier. She turned toward the edge of the field. The chopper was running. Colt was standing beside it, inspecting a panel. He looked up and met her gaze across the field. She felt a jolt of something unexpected, not attraction exactly, but recognition. Like she'd seen him before in a memory she couldn't place. Darnell followed her gaze. "That your boyfriend, Captain?" She didn't answer, but her voice dropped low. "Get back to push-ups." That evening, in the rented room above Mrs. Bonner's bakery, Rainey sat by the window, watching the last of the sun fade behind the mountains. She sipped coffee and stared at the clouds. She had come here to escape the noise, the ghosts, the constant hum of expectation, but somehow this quiet little town had brought a different kind of noise. A man who listened to engines with his eyes closed and looked at her like he already knew she was tired. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Colt standing there, holding a Tupperware container and a small, hesitant smile. "Chili," he said. "My son made too much. Thought you might be hungry." She accepted it, surprised. "Thank you." He turned to leave, but paused. Over his shoulder, he said, "Some things don't need fixing, Captain. They just need someone to believe they still matter." And then he walked down the hall, slow and steady, boots thudding like the heartbeat of the prairie. The clang of a dinner bell rang out across the back pasture, cutting through the golden hour haze like an old church chime. A dog barked once, then quieted. In the distance, the barn light flicked on, dim, amber, warm, like a promise. Colt Brennan stepped onto the porch of his farmhouse, wiping his hands on a rag, his boots coated in dry mud and bits of hay. The scent of chili still lingered on the wind. He watched as 2 boys, identical down to the way their shoulders slouched when called, trotted in from the edge of the field, where the creek curved like a ribbon of silver through the cottonwoods. 5 more minutes, Dad," shouted Tucker. "Stars'll be out by then," Colt called back. "And if you're not in, I'm eating your cornbread." Wyatt, the quieter twin, grinned and gave his brother a shove. "Told you we should have come back sooner." They ran past him, grass-stained and flushed, their breath forming small clouds in the cooling evening. Colt watched them go with a mixture of pride and something heavier, a quiet question he never voiced out loud. Am I doing enough? Inside, the kitchen was cozy in a lived-in kind of way. A calendar with smudged check marks, mismatched mugs hanging on a rack, a framed photo of a woman with wind-blown hair holding 2 chubby babies, her smile like a summer breeze. The photo had been there 7 years, and he'd never moved it. Colt ladled the chili into bowls as the boys washed up. Wyatt plopped down at the table first, eyeing the cornbread with suspicion. "Did you try to be fancy again?" Tucker grinned. He added cinnamon last time, said it was a creative risk. Colt raised a brow. "You know what else is risky? Criticizing the cook before dessert." They dug in anyway, laughter softening the edges of a long day. Midway through dinner, Tucker looked up with his mouth full. "You gave that extra batch to the soldier lady, right?" Colt nodded. Wyatt frowned. "You don't even know her. I know enough," Colt said simply. "She looks like someone who's had a lot of silence lately. Sometimes food says what words can't." The boys exchanged glances. Tucker wiggled his eyebrows. "You like her?" Colt didn't flinch. "I respect her." "But you smiled," Wyatt said, teasing. "That's rare." Colt stood to clear the bowls. "You know what else is rare? Dessert on a weeknight. Keep pushing me, and you'll be reminiscing about this mythical pie I was going to serve." The twins erupted into mock horror, but quieted as Colt returned to the table with a pie dish and 3 forks. As they ate, the night settled in. Meanwhile, Rainey Cross sat cross-legged on the twin bed in her rented room, the container of chili open beside her, half-eaten. She hadn't meant to eat all of it, but something about the flavor reminded her of things she hadn't let herself miss. Small-town kitchens, slow-cooked meals, the kind of generosity that didn't ask questions first. She pulled out her notepad and began jotting notes from the day. It was a habit she couldn't shake, a ritual from her deployment days. Log the facts. Process the edges. Darnell still challenges authority. Verbal deflection. Needs a physical outlet. The Brennan guy fixed that aircraft. By ear. Not standard. But the result? Undeniable. Possible PTSD signs. Quiet. Over-focused. But stable. Father. Twin boys, maybe 10 or 11. Brought food. Chili. Homemade. Generous. Unassuming. Made me feel. Seen? She paused at that last line, then scratched it out. The pen hovered above the page a moment longer, but nothing else came. Just a hum in her chest, and the image of a man who listened to machines like they were trying to speak. The next morning was sharp with frost. Rainey zipped her jacket tighter as she crossed the gravel drive toward the drill yard. The boys were already there, huddled and shivering, groaning about push-ups before sunrise. Colt was there, too, though not in any official capacity. He leaned against the fence, coffee in hand, watching the scene unfold with a quiet kind of humor. Rainey spotted him immediately. "You here to evaluate my teaching style?" she called across the field. Colt shrugged. "I figured if I fixed your dinner, I might as well see what you're training to destroy." She cracked a smile, small, but real, then turned back to the teens. "All right, form up. Brennan here thinks he's got jokes. Let's show him what unfunny looks like." The boys dropped to the ground and groaned through the first round of burpees. Colt sipped his coffee. "They look like they hate you. That's the goal," she said without looking back. "You're good at it. I was trained by the best." There was silence for a beat. Then Colt asked, "Why'd you come here, really?" She stopped, glanced back at him. "Because after 13 years in uniform, I forgot how to sleep with my boots off." He nodded, not as someone who pitied her, but as someone who understood. That afternoon, Colt invited her and the teens to visit the hangar again. It was unofficial, of course, but nobody in Fox Hollow paid too much mind to bureaucracy if something good came of it. As the teens poked around the chopper, Colt handed Rainey a tool set. "Want to learn how to listen to something that doesn't talk back?" he asked. She took the tools without hesitation. "Teach me." For the next hour, he walked her through the rhythm of the engine, the silent logic of its parts. No tech manuals, no acronyms, just sound, vibration, and intuition. Rainey had been around machinery her whole career, but this felt different. This felt human. The boys watched with surprising interest, even asking questions. "You two flirting?" Darnell blurted out at one point. Rainey didn't miss a beat. "If I were, you'd be the last to know." Even Colt laughed. It was the kind of day that passed quietly, but stayed with you long after. The kind of day people in uniform rarely allowed themselves. That night, back at the farmhouse, Colt sat with his boys under the stars, each with a blanket wrapped around their shoulders, the fire pit glowing low. Tucker asked, "Dad, are we ever going to have a mom again?" Colt didn't answer right away. The wind rustled through the dry grass like a whisper. "Then, Naolim, maybe if we meet someone kind, and brave, and smart enough not to run from two loud boys and one stubborn mechanic." Wyatt leaned against him, like that soldier lady. Colt smiled faintly, looking up at the stars. Maybe just like her, the wind rolled over the hills like a breath held too long. It carried the scent of pine and rust, and the faint trace of something burned from a nearby bonfire the teens had left smoking too long. At the edge of the ranch property, just past a barbed fence line, Rainey stood alone. Arms folded, boots planted firm, like she'd been stationed there for years. She wasn't on duty anymore, but the stance hadn't left her. Some habits sink deep into the muscle, beyond thought. Behind her, Colt walked slowly, quiet as dawn. You always watch the fence line like it's going to get up and run. Rainey didn't turn. Old habit. I used to stand post on Afghan ridge lines at 2 a.m. The wind there sounded just like this. "Funny," Colt said, stopping beside her. "I used to come out here after the boys were asleep. Stare past that same fence, not looking for threats, just hoping for, I don't know, a reason to stay hopeful." Now she turned. "You're not much for small talk, are you?" He grinned. Not much for rehearsed ones either. They stood in silence, two veterans of different battles, staring out at the same piece of earth. Finally she said, "You know I wasn't always a soldier." I gasped. No one's born in combat boots. "I grew up in a town like this," she said softly. "Only smaller. My dad owned a garage. Taught me how to pull apart a carburetor before I learned algebra. My mom taught piano lessons. She died when I was 15. Colt didn't speak. He knew when silence was the right kind of answer. "I joined the military because I didn't know what else to do with all the anger I had inside me." She continued, "I thought the army would burn it out, but the fire just changed shape. You seem steady to me." She gave a soft, humorless laugh. "That's the thing about soldiers. We get real good at walking while bleeding." Colt's eyes found hers. "Then maybe it's time to stop walking." A long pause. The wind brushed her hair across her cheek, and she didn't brush it away. "Why do you fix things, Colt?" she asked. He looked toward the barn, then toward the fading sunset. "Because things break." That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Back at the ranch house, the boys were doing what boys did best, making a mess of the kitchen while trying to help. Wyatt was stirring batter like it owed him money. Tucker was trying to separate eggshells from the mix he'd already dumped in. When Colt and Rainey walked in, They froze. "We're making peach cobbler," Tucker announced too loudly, as if volume could hide the flour on his nose. Colt raised an eyebrow. "Is the oven still intact?" Wyatt nodded solemnly. "For now." Rainey smiled despite herself. "Smells like sugar and chaos." "That's our usual Thursday," Colt said. Rainey rolled up her sleeves. "Well, Sergeant Cross reporting for dish duty." The boys cheered, as the kitchen filled with laughter and the scent of cinnamon and scorched peaches. Something invisible, but unmistakable, shifted in the air. There was no grand announcement, no strings or fireworks, but a kind of warmth spread across the room that only comes from shared effort, simple joy, and unspoken gratitude. After dinner, they sat on the porch. Rainey cradled a mug of tea in her hands. Colt rocked slowly in his father's old chair. The boys ran out into the dark, pretending to lasso each other with jump ropes. "You know," Colt said after a while, "I never thought I'd sit on this porch with someone again. Not like this." "Like what?" "Like it meant something." Rainey didn't look at him. "You say things real plain, Colt. I figure we waste too many years saying nothing." She turned then, studying him in the soft porch light. His jaw was rough with stubble. His eyes were steady, but not guarded. That was new. "You're a good dad," she said. "I try. Most days, I just try not to mess up more than I fix." "Is that why you don't date?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "You ever been afraid of needing someone again?" She nodded. "Yeah." He looked at her then. Really looked. "Then we understand each other." The next day brought one of those autumn storms that didn't ask permission. The sky turned the color of old denim, and the wind howled like it was searching for something lost. At the drill field, Rainey was instructing her small unit of troubled teens when the storm broke loose. Sheets of rain poured sideways, drenching uniforms, soaking boots. The kids scrambled for shelter. Except Darnell. He stood in the middle of the field, eyes wild, jaw clenched. Rainey ran toward him. "Darnell, you need to move." He didn't flinch. "I said move." He snapped then. "Why? So I can run like everyone else. I don't run, not from people like you." She stopped short. Rain poured from the brim of her cap. Colt had seen the commotion from the hangar. He jogged toward them, stopping just behind her. "Let me," he said gently. She hesitated, then nodded. Colt walked up to Darnell slowly. "You're angry." The teen bristled. "Yeah, and you think you're alone in that." Darnell's fists were clenched. His chest heaved. Colt stepped closer. "I buried a wife when my boys were 3. Held their hands while they asked why Mom didn't wake up. I've screamed into tractor engines and cried behind closed doors. You think you're the only one walking through fire. Son, we're all smoke damaged." Darnell blinked, the anger in his eyes beginning to crack. Colt held out his hand. "Come inside. You don't have to prove anything to anybody out here." The boy looked at the hand like it was a foreign object. Then slowly, he took it. As they walked back toward the building, Rainey met Colt's eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. He shrugged, his shirt soaked through, his hair dripping. "You look like you could use a hand." She smiled, full this time. And just like that, the storm didn't feel so cold anymore. The day after the storm, the ranch woke under skies scrubbed clean. The air carried that scent unique to the American Midwest after a downpour. Wet earth, sweet hay, and wood still drying from the night before. Colt stood outside the barn, tugging on a stubborn hinge that squeaked every time he opened it, while the boys chased each other barefoot through the dew-soaked grass. Rainey leaned on the fence post near the pasture, watching the scene unfold with a stillness that didn't come from fatigue, but from something quieter, like a memory that refused to settle. Colt noticed her stillness. "Looks like you're a million miles away," he called out, brushing his hands on his jeans. She gave him a small smile. "Closer to 20 years. Bad memory." "Not all bad," she said, "but it changed everything." She stepped closer, her voice even. "There was a fire. I was 11. My mom had just finished making peach preserves. I still remember the smell. Then one of the burners sparked, something faulty in the wiring. Within minutes, the kitchen was ablaze." Colt listened quietly, his expression softening. "She got me out, shoved me through the back door. Then she ran back inside. Said she needed to grab Dad's photo. He'd passed a year before. She didn't come out." The words hung between them, like smoke lingering long after the flames had died. "I used to think," she said, voice nearly breaking, "if I'd screamed louder, pulled harder, maybe she'd have stayed out." Colt's voice was low and steady. "You were a child, Rainey. It was never yours to carry." She looked at him, surprised by the kindness in his tone. Not pity, something steadier, understanding. "That's when I stopped feeling like a kid," she said. "That day." Colt took a slow breath. "You know, I lost my dad to a tractor rollover. He was working in the dark after a storm, same one I used to ignore. I was 17, thought I could have stopped it if I hadn't been out chasing a girl in town." They stood in shared silence. Two lives split by grief, somehow meeting at the same bend in the road. "I never told anyone that," Colt said. "Not even the boys." "Why now?" she asked. "Maybe 'cause you're the first person who'd understand it without trying to fix it." Later that afternoon, Rainey helped Wyatt and Tucker mend a fence on the north side of the property, though help was generous, considering Tucker got his arm stuck in the slats and Wyatt fell backward into a patch of burrs. Colt joined them with a toolbox and a steady laugh, the kind that wrapped around the moment like a well-worn blanket. "You boys are lucky she's got more patience than I do," Colt chuckled as Rainey knelt beside Tucker, gently prying his elbow free. "She's a lot cooler than you, Dad," Wyatt declared. "Don't think I didn't know that already," Colt muttered under his breath. Rainey glanced at him and smirked. "Well, at least you're self-aware." As they finished up, Tucker wandered over to her with something in his hand, a rough chunk of wood shaped like a heart, carved with a pocket knife. "I made this," he said shyly, holding it out. "For you." Rainey crouched to his level, her eyes soft. "Why, Tucker?" "Because you stayed." She froze, the simple words striking deeper than he could know. She took the carved heart like it was something fragile and priceless. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll keep it." Colt watched the exchange from a few feet away, his throat tightening. His sons had always been perceptive, but that was different. That was something deeper, something healing. That evening, Rainey found Colt in the old hayloft, tuning a battered modern guitar he hadn't touched since his wife died. Dust clung to the strings, but the tone was still warm, still whole. "You play?" she asked, stepping lightly into the loft. "Used to. Got rusty. The boys never heard me. Why now?" He looked up, surprised by his own answer. "Because you stayed." She smiled at the echo of her earlier moment with Tucker. Colt strummed a few notes, clumsy but heartfelt. He paused, then nodded toward the bench beside him. "You sing?" "Badly," she said. "That's my favorite kind." She sat beside him, knees touching. And for the next hour, Under the dim light of an old work lamp, they played. Him fumbling with chords, her humming along off-key, the sound imperfect, but full of something better than harmony. Honesty. That night, after the boys were asleep and the dishes were done, Rainey stepped outside for air. The stars were sharp in the cold sky, glittering like glass spread across velvet. Colt joined her quietly. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I said the first day." "You mean the line about needing a wife and me needing strong sons?" He chuckled. "Yeah, not exactly how I'd say it now. How would you?" "I'd say, I need someone who sees what's broken and doesn't run. And I'd like to be that. For someone, too." Rainey turned to him, her eyes shining not from the starlight, but from something softer. "You're better at plain talk than poetry, Colt." "Good," he said, voice low. "I ain't much of a poet." He took her hand, slow, uncertain, but brave. And she didn't let go. The morning light was soft through the ranch house windows, casting golden strips across the floorboards. The smell of pancakes and fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen. Rainey stood at the stove, flipping a final round of pancakes with the ease of someone who hadn't done it in years, but hadn't forgotten how. Tucker sat on the counter beside her, his chin resting in one palm, legs swinging. Colt leaned in the doorway, watching the scene like it was something out of a dream he didn't want to disturb. "You're spoiling them," he said gently. Rainey smirked. "Too late. This one asked me last night if I knew how to make apple pie." "Do you?" Colt asked. "Of course. I'm from Kentucky. They teach us that before we can walk." Tucker raised his hand. "Can you teach me?" "Only if you promise not to eat half the filling before it goes in the crust." He nodded solemnly. "Deal." Wyatt came racing in, socks sliding across the wood floor. "Dad, the post truck left a package by the gate. I think it's for her." Rainey wiped her hands and followed him out, stepping into the crisp morning. The box was small, wrapped in dull brown paper with military postage stamped across the top. Her name was handwritten in neat block letters. Sergeant Rainey Briggs. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers pausing on the tape. Colt stood nearby, not speaking, just present. Inside was a weathered leather satchel and a folded envelope. She took the note first. "Found this with your things in storage. Figured you might want it back. Thought you'd come home by now. Mac." Her fingers tightened around the leather strap. The satchel had belonged to her father, passed to her on the day she shipped out for her first deployment. Inside it had been everything that grounded her. Photos, a compass, a pressed flower her mother once gave her. She hadn't seen it in 5 years. Rainey blinked hard and turned away. "It's nothing," she said too fast. Colt didn't move. "Then why's your hand shaking?" She let out a breath. "Because I didn't expect to still care about any of it. I thought I'd buried this version of myself when I put on the uniform. Turns out she's still in there. Then let her out." Colt said softly, "She's not the enemy." Rainey looked at him. "And if she's tired, if she doesn't know where she fits anymore?" "Then she's in the right place," Colt said, "because nobody here fits a mold. We just figure it out as we go." That afternoon, Rainey took the boys into town while Colt stayed behind to mend some corral posts. She drove the old pickup into Main Street, its engine rattling slightly, and parked outside the feed store. Wyatt bolted inside looking for jawbreakers. Tucker clung to her side, eyes wide with curiosity. She hadn't been in a real town in years. Military bases didn't count. There was something different about how people looked you in the eye here, like they saw more than the uniform. Or maybe less. Inside the store, Mrs. Addy, the gray-haired shopkeeper with bright pink glasses, recognized her instantly. "You're Colt's guest," she said, reaching over the counter. "The soldier girl with the heart-shaped face." "I'm not sure about the face," Rainey said, laughing. "But yes, Rainey Briggs." Rainey. Addie tasted the name like it meant something. "You staying for a while?" "I don't know yet." "Well," Addie said, ringing up a sack of sugar and some threadbare gloves Tucker found, "sometimes we think we're just passing through until the place gets in our bones." Back at the ranch, Colt finished patching the last post when he saw the truck return. Rainey stepped out, a paper bag in one hand, Tucker asleep in the passenger seat. She walked up to him with a small grin. "I got suckered into a pound of licorice and a second-hand cowboy hat." "Sounds like a solid trade," he said. "And Addie says I have a heart-shaped face." "She's right," he said, before he could stop himself. She looked up at him, unsure for just a moment, but didn't look away. That evening, they lit a fire in the backyard pit. The boys roasted marshmallows, faces sticky with sugar and soot. Rainey wrapped herself in a woven quilt Colt had pulled from the cedar chest inside, the scent of cedar clinging to the wool like a memory. They sat side by side in the camp chairs as the stars bloomed overhead. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that the only place I'd ever feel useful was out there, in uniform." Colt listened. "But out there, I was always leaving something behind. Someone behind." "And now?" he asked. She looked toward the boys, now curled up on a log, sharing a marshmallow stick and whispering jokes. "Now I'm scared that if I stay, I won't know how to be anything else." Colt didn't offer her a solution. Instead, he reached into the satchel that had arrived earlier and pulled out something she hadn't noticed missing. A photo of her and her unit, dirt-smeared and proud, standing in front of a dusty tent. He handed it to her, eyes steady. "You're not leaving her behind. You're just giving her a place to set her bag down." Rainey stared at the image, then at Colt, then at the boys. And somewhere between the firelight and the soft night wind, something inside her, something old and armor-plated, began to melt. A soft rain swept over the prairie by morning, tapping gently against the tin roof of the house like a lullaby that came late. Colt stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the mist roll over the pastures. The air smelled like wet earth and spring coming early, though it was still winter on the calendar. Behind him, the door creaked open. Rainey stepped out barefoot, wrapped in one of Colt's old flannel shirts she'd borrowed the night before. Her hair was loose for once, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, untamed by the usual bun she wore like armor. "You're up early," he said. "I never really slept," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. "Bad dreams?" She shook her head. "No, just... It's strange to rest somewhere and not have to keep one boot on the floor. You get used to tension. When it's gone, the silence feels louder." Colt handed her his mug. "Then let's ease into the silence together." She smiled, sipping from his cup, letting the warmth spread through her chest. The porch light above them was still on, forgotten from the night before. Rainey looked up at it. "My dad used to say that when someone leaves and you care, you leave the porch light on, so they can find their way back." Colt followed her gaze. "Then I guess mine's been on a long time." She tilted her head, studying him. "Were you waiting for someone?" He didn't answer right away, just looked out into the gray morning, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than 100 spoken words. "No," he said finally, "but I hoped someone might be waiting to be found." That day, Colt took Rainey and the boys to the north pasture, over the ridge where the old windmill stood, half broken and turning lazily in the wind. The truck bounced over muddy ruts, the boys yelling in excitement as Rainey gripped the dash and laughed for the first time in days. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked as they got out. Colt pointed to a small grove of cottonwoods near a shallow stream. That's where I buried Sadie. Rainey turned, surprised. Your wife? He nodded. I wanted you to meet her, he added softly. At least, where she rests. Rainey's smile faded into something more solemn. She didn't say anything, just followed him quietly. The grave wasn't much, just a weathered wooden cross with a rusted horseshoe nailed to it. Wildflowers had sprung up around the base, even in the chill. Colt stood still, hands in his jacket pockets. She died the year the twins turned 5. Cancer, quick and cruel. Rainey swallowed, the wind catching her breath. I'm sorry. He nodded. So was I. She knelt beside the cross, brushing away some stray leaves. She was beautiful, Rainey said, though she'd only seen photos in the hallway. She was light, all light, the kind of person who made you want to be better just by waking up next to her. And now, Rainey asked, not quite looking up. Colt crouched beside her, his voice rougher now. Now I'm learning that grief and love aren't opposites. They live side by side. You don't stop missing the one who's gone, but maybe you can still make room for someone who's here. Later that evening, Rainey sat on the porch alone, knees pulled up to her chest, blanket draped over her shoulders. The sky above was clear again, stars scattered like salt on black velvet. She thought of Sadie, of the cross in the field, of how love, real love, could linger long after the person was gone. The door creaked again. Colt stepped out, holding 2 mugs of cocoa this time. He offered one wordlessly and sat beside her. They sipped in silence. I talked to the VA office today, she said quietly. He looked over. Yeah? They've got an opening. Civilian role. Working with returning female vets. Transition support. Right here in the county. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You thinking of taking it? I'm thinking. Maybe I don't have to run anymore. He didn't respond right away, just leaned back in the rocker and let the words settle. Rainey continued, her voice unsteady but honest. Colt, I'm not the kind of woman people wait for. I'm hard. I'm stubborn. I come with miles on my soul and cracks I haven't figured out how to fill. He turned to her, his gaze steady and unflinching. You're not asking anyone to wait, Rainey. You've already arrived. A pause. Her eyes shimmered, catching the porch light that still glowed above them like a silent promise. I don't know how to be a wife, she whispered. He reached over, gently taking her hand. Good, he said, because I don't need a wife. I need you. Her breath hitched, not from surprise, but from the sudden and terrifying truth that maybe, just maybe, she needed him too. Inside, the boys were asleep, curled up on the same couch beneath a wool blanket. The house was quiet, warm, lived in, outside, on that old wooden porch, where hearts had once broken and healed again. The light stayed on. Not because someone was lost, but because finally, someone had come home. Rainey awoke to the smell of frying bacon and fresh cornbread. Comforting, homely scents that reminded her of a life she'd never quite had. She lay still for a moment in the small guest room, watching the light filter through the lace curtain. For the first time in years, she hadn't been jolted awake by a memory or a phantom noise. Just warmth. Just quiet. Down the hall, she heard Colt whistling low and steady, like a man who wasn't in a rush, but had nothing to hide either. She sat up, bare feet brushing the hardwood floor, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered how long it would last. This sense of peace that felt both foreign and familiar. When she entered the kitchen, Colt looked up from the skillet with a boyish grin. Morning, soldier. She raised an eyebrow at him. "That's Major Soldier to you." He smirked. "Yes, ma'am." The boys were already at the table, hair tousled, cheeks puffed with cornbread and syrup on their pajamas. One of them, Eli, looked up and waved a sticky hand. "Miss Rainey, Dad made extra for you." She sat, and Colt set a plate in front of her like he'd done it 1,000 times. No grand gestures, no clumsy attempts at charm. Just a man doing what needed to be done. "Colt," she said softly, as the boys ran off after breakfast to chase the dog in the front yard. "I think I could get used to this." He didn't look at her, just poured coffee into her mug. "You don't have to get used to it, Rainey. You just have to let it be." Later that day, she found herself standing in the mudroom, staring at the row of boots by the door. There were 3 pairs of small, muddy ones, kicked off carelessly. Colt's were there too, dusty and worn, laces tied in a quick knot. And then, oddly enough, there was a new space cleared out beside his, empty, like an invitation. She bent down, placing her own scuffed combat boots neatly next to his. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. That afternoon, Colt drove her into town in his battered old pickup. The VA office was located in a modest brick building beside the post office, with a single faded flag fluttering above the entrance. Rainey hadn't been inside since her last discharge appointment. She sat in the truck for a minute too long, fingers clenched around the handle. "You okay?" Colt asked gently. "I haven't walked into a place like this without feeling like I'm about to fight for my life." "You're not fighting today," he said. "You're showing up. That's braver." That made her swallow a lump she didn't know was rising. She nodded, opened the door, and walked inside. The meeting with the director was short but promising. They wanted her on staff, wanted her to speak to other women who'd felt invisible after service. Her deployment record, her medical training, her resilience. It all mattered. When she stepped back out onto the steps, Colt was leaning against the truck, arms folded, like he knew how it would go. "Well," he asked. "They offered me the job." A pause. "Start Monday." He grinned. "So you'll be staying a while." She didn't answer, just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his middle. It wasn't a romantic hug, not yet, but it was the kind of hug that said, "I want to belong somewhere, and maybe it's here." On the way back, they stopped at the grocery store. The boys had asked for marshmallows, and Rainey, still adjusting to civilian motherhood, grabbed the wrong size. "These are for cocoa, not campfires," Colt teased. "Well, I don't see a bonfire in the kitchen, do you?" He chuckled. "Remind me not to question a soldier in the baking aisle." She smiled at that, really smiled. And then, as they passed the end cap near the checkout line, she paused. There was a sale rack with boots, women's work boots, scuffed but solid. She picked up a pair and tried them on. They fit perfectly. Colt watched her, arms crossed again, his gaze unreadable. "You buying boots for the job?" "No," she said quietly. "I'm buying boots for the life." He gave a slow nod. "Good." They drove home in silence, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was full, thoughtful, like something unspoken was being sown between them with every mile. That night, as the wind howled outside and a light snow began to dust the roof, Rainey stepped out onto the porch. She looked up at the porch light, still burning softly above the doorway. Then down at the pair of boots she'd worn that day, now resting next to Colt's again. This time, not by accident. Inside, she heard him humming an old country song. While loading the dishwasher, the boys were giggling upstairs, probably jumping on the beds even though they weren't supposed to. She walked back inside, pulled off her jacket, and hung it beside his on the peg. Then, without thinking too hard about it, she grabbed Colt's hand as he turned from the sink. He froze, eyes meeting hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. And in that moment, the porch light didn't just stay on. It glowed a little brighter, because someone wasn't just passing through anymore. Someone had stayed. Snow blanketed the ranch overnight, softening the edges of every fence post and haystack, turning the rugged landscape into something quiet and almost holy. Rainey stood at the kitchen window early that morning, still in her long-sleeved thermal shirt and wool socks, cradling a mug of coffee between her hands. She didn't remember the last time she watched snow fall and didn't feel cold inside. Colt came in from the barn, boots wet, hat dusted in white. He stomped the snow off his soles and looked up at her with that easy, unshaken gaze that was beginning to feel like home. "You're up early," he said, pulling off his gloves. "I wanted to see the morning," she replied. "You've seen 1,000 mornings," he said with a grin. "Yeah, but this one's quiet," she said, like it's trying to say something. He studied her for a beat. "What's it sayin', Major?" She looked back out the window. That maybe this life is still worth choosing, when later that day, Colt brought the boys out to the backfield to let them burn off energy in the snow. Rainey joined them with a thermos of cocoa, watching from the old wooden fence as the twins launched snowballs at each other like it was a war zone, laughing, slipping, making little forts with crooked walls. Colt leaned beside her, arms resting on the top rail. "Been meaning to ask you something," he said, voice low. Rainey didn't move. "Go ahead." He took a moment. "You ever think about starting over?" She glanced at him. "You mean like a clean slate?" "No," he said. "I mean, like a second chapter. Not because the first was bad, just because maybe it was never supposed to be the whole story." She blinked, absorbing the weight behind those words. Colt had lost his wife. She had lost her identity, her certainty, her sense of peace. Starting over wasn't about erasing what came before. It was about finding the courage to keep writing. "I think about it," she said finally, "but I don't know if I'd recognize it if it showed up." He looked over at her, soft and sure. "You'd recognize it. It'd be the thing that didn't run away when you were scared. The one that stood still when you pushed. The one that made space instead of noise." She felt her chest tighten, not in fear, but in hope. And that was worse somehow. Hope meant risk. That night, after the boys were in bed, Rainey sat on the couch with a stack of paperwork for her new position at the VA. Colt came in carrying 2 mugs of peppermint tea, his late-night ritual, apparently, and sat beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. They didn't talk for a while, just let the silence settle between them like an old quilt. "I used to think," she said at last, "that there were only 2 types of people in the world, those who survived and those who didn't." He didn't speak, just waited. "But maybe there's a third kind," she continued. "The ones who survive, and then choose to live." Colt set his mug down. "That's what you're doing, Rainey. You're choosing." She turned to him, searching his face. "What about you? What are you choosing?" He gave her a half smile. "To ask you a question I've been sitting on for a while." Her breath caught. "What kind of question?" "The kind that changes everything," he said. She froze. "I'm not asking anything today," he added quickly. "Not until you're sure." "What if I never am?" "Then I'll wait," he said simply. "I'd rather walk beside you unsure than run ahead without you." The next morning, she found something on the kitchen table. A small, square note, written in neat block letters. "Your boots look better beside mine. Just saying." "See." She smiled, folded it, tucked it into her pocket. As she turned to make breakfast, one of the boys came bounding down the stairs. "Miss Rainey," Eli called out, "can you help me with my snow boots? They won't listen to me." She knelt beside him, helping him tug the stubborn boots over his socks, and paused when she saw the pair of mismatched laces, one red, one blue. "Why the different colors?" she asked. Eli grinned. "So I always know which foot is which. Daddy taught me that." "Smart man," she said. "Yep. And he says, if you ever get lost, you just find the person with the same boot size as you and walk in their footprints till you feel safe." She looked up toward the hallway where Colt's boots waited by the door. Her gaze softened. "I think your daddy's onto something," she whispered. Later, when Colt returned from running fence line repairs, she met him at the porch. "I've been thinking," she said. He brushed snow from his shoulder. "That sounds dangerous." She smiled. "I don't want to start over." His brow lifted. "No?" She stepped forward. "I want to continue." He waited, heart thudding like a hammer in his chest. "With you," she added. He exhaled a long, slow breath, like he'd been holding it in for years. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm sure I want to find out." He nodded, stepped closer, and for the first time, he didn't wait for permission. He kissed her, not like a man who was claiming, but like one who was finally receiving. And Rainey, who had fought in deserts and cried in silence and carried pain so deep it carved her hollow, finally felt something settle in her chest. Not fire, not fear, but peace. The wind had picked up that afternoon, rattling the barn doors and whispering secrets through the gaps in the old siding. Inside the ranch house, Rainey stood in the study, holding something fragile in her hands. A weathered, unsealed envelope, the edges curled and yellowing with age. She had found it by accident, tucked behind a row of Colt's old military medals in the drawer he rarely opened. At first, she thought it was something official, maybe a commendation or discharge note. But when she saw the handwriting, slanted and sure, her heart paused. It was addressed, "To the woman I never thought I'd meet." She sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, the silence in the room settling like dust. The paper inside was creased down the middle, as if it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. "I never sent this because I thought it would be foolish. A man like me, still grieving, still waking up to an empty side of the bed, writing to a woman who didn't exist yet. But I needed to believe she might, that somewhere out there was someone who wouldn't be scared off by my silence or ashamed of the way I break sometimes. I'm not looking for someone to fix me. I've learned how to function. But I wonder if there's someone who sees the man I used to be and still wants to stand beside who I am now. She'll have to be strong, but not the kind of strong that never cries, the kind that survives storms without losing her softness. If she has her own ghosts, I hope mine know how to make room. And if she ever reads this, then I guess I've already met her." Rainey pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes brimming with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel today. She didn't know when Colt had written those words. Maybe long before they met, maybe during one of those cold nights after his wife passed, when the ache in the house was louder than any TV or passing storm. But one thing was certain, he hadn't written it for anyone in particular. And now, years later, it had found its way into the hands of the only woman who truly understood. Free line. That evening, Colt returned from the pastures with frost in his beard and mud on his boots. Rainey was waiting on the porch swing, the letter folded neatly in her lap. "I found something," she said without looking at him. He sat down beside her, hesitating when he noticed the paper. "I didn't mean to snoop," she said gently, but it wasn't hidden too well. His face flushed a little, weathered hands clasping and unclasping. That was a long time ago. I figured, she said. He glanced at her. Did it make you uncomfortable? No, she replied, meeting his eyes. It made me feel chosen, even before you knew who I was. His shoulders sank with relief. I almost threw it out 12 times. I'm glad you didn't. They sat in quiet for a while, rocking slowly, the cold air nipping at their cheeks. I wrote letters like that too, she said softly. In a combat tent in Kandahar, in the back of a medevac. Letters to someone who didn't exist. But I stopped writing them. Why? Because I stopped believing he was out there. Colt turned to her fully now. And now, she smiled faintly. Now, I think maybe we were just riding toward each other. Later that night, they gathered the boys in front of the fireplace. It had become a sort of family ritual. The boys piled in blankets, Colt poking at the flames, Rainey reading aloud from old cowboy tales or history books that made them ask 100 questions. Tonight, though, she put the book down. I want to tell you boys something real, she said. Colt looked over, curious. You know how soldiers have letters they keep in case? Well, in case they don't come home. Both boys nodded, a little more serious than usual. Well, Rainey continued, I had one of those letters, but I also had another one I never sent. One that said what I hoped for after war. Like a dream, Eli asked. Exactly, she said. A dream where I wasn't scared all the time, where I wasn't alone, where there were 2 boys running wild across a snowy field, and one man who made me believe in quiet again. Colt's eyes misted. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. And now? Caleb asked. She looked at both boys. Now, I don't need to write those letters anymore. After the boys had gone to bed, Colt and Rainey stayed up, watching the fire dim. The silence between them wasn't the lonely kind. It was rich, full of all the things they no longer had to say. He broke it anyway. I never showed that letter to anyone before, he said. I know. I was afraid. Of what? That the woman I wrote it for would never show up. Rainey leaned her head against his shoulder. She did. She whispered. And in that moment, neither of them felt like survivors anymore. They felt like home. The first snow came early that year. Thick, slow flakes drifting across the Wyoming hills, like feathers shaken loose from heaven. The ranch turned into a quiet painting of white and gray, interrupted only by the tracks of boots and hooves. Colt stood at the fence line, watching the boys wrestle in the snow. Eli, always the bolder of the two, tackled his brother into a drift. Their laughter carried across the field, warm even in the cold. Rainey joined him with 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling between her gloved fingers. She handed him one and stood beside him, their elbows brushing. They're starting to feel like they belong, she said. They do, Colt replied, eyes still fixed on the boys. But it's not over yet. She nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. The foster system had granted temporary placement, but the hearing to determine permanent guardianship was just days away. And Rainey knew too well that bureaucracy rarely cared about warmth or healing or love. It cared about paperwork. Colt had filled out every form with the same quiet determination he gave to every other part of his life. But he had one hesitation left, one box left unchecked, one truth he had kept to himself. Rainey had seen it. Colt, she said carefully, you still haven't filled in the part about your late wife, about what happened. He took a long sip from his mug. Because they'll use it against me. They might, she admitted. But if you hide it, they'll use that against you too. His jaw worked quietly, I don't want the boys to be a reminder of everything I lost. I want them to be the start of something new." She reached for his hand and wrapped her fingers around it. "Then show them that. The system can only see what we're willing to reveal." The night before the hearing, Colt pulled a worn cardboard box from the top of his closet. Inside were things he hadn't touched in years. A dried bouquet from his wife's funeral, the dog tags she'd worn in Afghanistan, the first ultrasound picture of the son they never got to raise. He sat on the floor, Rainey beside him, as he pulled out each item, like peeling back a layer of himself. "She was a good woman," he said quietly. "Strong. Stubborn. The kind of stubborn that kept me alive more than once. She'd have to be." Rainey smiled gently. "We lost our baby at 20 weeks. Complications. After that, it was like her light dimmed a little every day." He looked down, and I didn't know how to save her. "You were grieving too," Rainey whispered. "I was, but I hid it. I thought being a man meant staying quiet, staying strong. By the time I realized how wrong that was, it was too late." Rainey leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're not the same man anymore." "No," he agreed. "Now I know strength isn't about silence." He placed the photo back into the box. "It's about fighting for someone, even when you're scared to lose again." The courtroom was colder than the weather outside. Plain walls, sterile lights, and the hum of forced air rattling through ducts overhead. Colt wore his best shirt and boots freshly polished. Rainey sat behind him, her uniform neatly pressed, her presence calm but powerful. The boys were with a caseworker in the hallway, unaware of the gravity of what was unfolding inside. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s, reading over the files with professional detachment. Beside her sat the social worker, lips pursed, her pen tapping lightly. "Mr. Maddox," the judge said, glancing over her glasses, "you've submitted all documentation except one required section, details regarding your previous spouse and any dependent children. Can you explain this omission?" Colt stood slowly, holding the paper in his hand. "Yes, ma'am. I brought it today." He stepped forward, offering the filled-in section and a handwritten letter. "I'd like this entered into the record," he said. The judge read in silence. Then she looked up. "You wrote that your son never got to be born, that your wife passed soon after, and that for years you didn't think you'd ever be a father." "Yes," he said, voice low but steady. "And now—" "Now," Colt said, turning to look at Rainey and then toward the closed doors where the boys waited. "I know being a father isn't about biology. It's about standing in the gap, about showing up, again and again, even when it's hard." He took a breath. "Those boys aren't filling a hole left by my past. They're building something new with me. They've taught me more about hope than I thought I'd ever feel again." The judge sat back slowly. The room was silent for several seconds. Then she looked at the social worker. "Do you have any objections to the recommendation for permanent guardianship?" The woman shook her head. "None. The home visits show stability. The boys are thriving. And with Miss Sullivan's support, I believe this placement is not only suitable, it's healing." The judge nodded. "Then it's decided. Permanent guardianship is granted." In the hallway, Colt dropped to one knee and opened his arms as the boys ran toward him. "You mean it?" Caleb asked, eyes wide. "We really get to stay?" "You're not just staying," Colt said, his voice catching. "You're home." Eli threw his arms around Colt's neck. Caleb joined, and they all knelt there, a tangle of snow-damp jackets and muffled tears. Rainey stood back, a soft smile spreading across her face. Colt looked up at her, eyes glistening. "We've got sons, Rainey," he said. She stepped forward, crouching beside them, wrapping her arms around them all. "No," she whispered. "We've got a family." The kitchen was filled with the golden scent of cornbread and slow-cooked stew. The windows steamed up against the chill outside, where snow still blanketed the hills. But inside the Maddox ranch, it felt like a living heart had begun to beat again. Colt stirred the pot one last time before turning down the flame. He looked across the room where Caleb and Eli were setting the table, one fork slightly crooked, napkins folded with the clumsy care only children could manage. He didn't correct them. It was perfect as it was. Rainey entered from the mudroom, kicking off her boots and pulling her braid free from beneath her wool-lined cap. She had a tiny smear of hay dust on her cheek, and the sight of it made Colt smile without even knowing it. "You smell like home," she said, grinning as she lifted the lid on the pot. "And I'm starving." Colt crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead. "You'll be fed. Promise." As they all took their seats, Colt hesitated. There were 5 chairs now, not 4. 5. And for the first time since his late wife's passing, the chair across from him was filled with more than just a shadow of memory. It was filled with Rainey's light. "Dad," Eli blurted, holding a spoon like a baton, "can we say the words tonight, like real families do on Thanksgiving?" Colt glanced at Rainey, who nodded encouragingly. "You mean what you're thankful for?" Colt asked. Caleb nodded quickly. "Yeah, but only one thing. Just one." Colt cleared his throat. "All right then, you first." Caleb stood dramatically and placed his little hand over his heart. "I'm thankful for cows, because without cows, there's no burgers." Laughter bubbled around the table. "Eli?" Rainey asked, smiling. Eli got serious for a moment, his blue eyes narrowing in thought. "I'm thankful we don't live in that gray place anymore, that you and Dad let us stay, and that you love us even when we get muddy." Colt felt the lump rise in his throat. Uninvited, but undeniable, Rainey reached under the table and squeezed his hand. "And you, Rainey?" Colt asked, his voice husky. She looked at the boys first, then at Colt. "I'm thankful for second chances," she said softly, "and for finding home in the last place I thought to look." Silence settled sweetly over them, like snow on fence posts. Colt swallowed hard, then stood, resting his hands on the back of his chair. "I'm thankful for a woman brave enough to walk through a blizzard," he said, meeting Rainey's eyes, "and for 2 boys who taught me how to live again." Then he smiled. "And I'm thankful this table finally fits us all." Later that night, once the boys were fast asleep under flannel sheets and faded quilts, Colt and Rainey sat on the porch swing, bundled in wool blankets and each other. The stars hung low over the ranch, more visible than ever in the stillness of winter. Rainey leaned into Colt's side, her head resting beneath his chin. "You ever think about the future?" she asked. "Only every time I look at you." She smiled, but her voice turned quieter. "I mean, really think about it. Like rings and last names, that kind of future." Colt didn't answer right away. He rocked them gently with one boot against the floorboards, letting the silence stretch, not with fear, but with awe. "I was afraid to want that again," he said finally, afraid that wanting meant betraying the past. "But now, I realize the only way to honor it is to live." He turned to face her, brushing a strand of wind-blown hair from her face. "I want that future, Rainey, every part of it, with you, with the boys, with whatever comes next." Her lips trembled, not from cold, but from the emotion surging up. "You sure, cowboy?" He grinned. Rainey Sullivan, you marched onto my ranch like a storm and cleared out every ghost I thought would stay forever. I've never been more sure of anything." She cupped his face in her hands and kissed him. Soft, slow, and certain. When they parted, Colt whispered, "You'll marry me, won't you?" She laughed through a tear. "You really think I'd let you raise strong sons without a strong wife beside you?" Spring came late but gentle. The fields turned green again, and the wind brought the smell of rain and new life. Colt and Rainey exchanged vows beneath the cottonwoods, with Caleb and Eli standing proudly beside them, ring-bearers, speech-givers, mud on their shoes, mischief-makers. The ceremony was simple. No orchestra, no silk, just boots in the grass, honest words, and a promise that didn't need diamonds to shine. Afterward, back at the ranch, Rainey pulled out a surprise. A wooden sign carved by hand, stained and polished with care. It read, "The Maddox Family." Chadois, forever Colt lifted it, stared at the name, the word family, etched deep. "You carved this?" he asked. She nodded. "With Eli's help. Caleb mostly handed me snacks." He laughed and hung it right by the front door, where all could see. Years later, folks in town would talk about the Maddox place as more than a ranch. They'd say it was where hope grew wild and healing rode in on horseback. Kids with nowhere to go found direction there. Strangers found warmth, and those who'd lost everything found they hadn't lost the chance to start again. But Colt never talked much about all that. He just looked across the dinner table, now even bigger, as friends and adopted hearts came and went, and thanked God that once upon a time, in a snow-covered moment of courage, he had looked at a soldier and said, "I need a wife, you need strong sons." And everything changed. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Has a moment of kindness ever changed your life, just like it did for them? If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing for more real, human stories that restore faith in love and family and in the quiet strength of good people. Thank you for spending your time with us, from our little storytelling corner to wherever you are. We're grateful you're here.